Albert, E.J. Dionne, Francis Fukuyama, and author Justin Wise discuss the evolution of neoconservatism. The Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. hosts the hour-and-a-half event.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here. I know that the very fact that you're here means that you don't need to hear too much of an introduction of our panel. You all know E.J. and Frank and Bill, and a terrific panel indeed, and I'm going to say a word or two in a couple of minutes about Justin, who has turned in his homework in a fashion that allows us to have this discussion. What I did want to do at the outset is to offer just a couple of words in a fairly personal vein about the topic and the program and the author. I think I can start with a proposition that is not controversial. I'd be pleased if I could rise to the challenge of saying something that might elicit some disagreement in the course of these remarks. But the working proposition of the book and of the careers of the four colleagues you see up here is also very much at the core of Brookings's identity and mission. And that is that good policy and good governance depend very importantly on sound ideas. That means that politics, which is a necessary part of reaching good policies, and I mean both domestic and international politics, should have sound intellectual underpinnings. Now, with regard to U.S. foreign policy, which is an important part of the discussion this afternoon, too often the debate and discussion of foreign policy tend to treat diplomacy and national security policy as though they were entirely determined by electoral forces, by lobbies, by special interests, by economic considerations, and what you might call pure geopolitical considerations, and not enough attention is given to the role of ideas and political philosophy. I think we're going to go a little bit in the direction of correcting that over the course of the discussion this afternoon. One set of ideas that has, of course, gotten a lot of attention is loosely under the rubric of neoconservatism. And that, of course, is in the title of Justin's book, and it's going to be part of what the panel is going to be talking about. And here I would like to make just a couple of personal remarks. I don't know about E.J. and Bill and Frank and whether they would share any version of what I'm about to say, but I did check it with Justin first, and I've also read his book and had a pretty good idea that he has in his own head a version of this thought. And that is that there is something that should make us all a little bit uneasy about the very term, neoconservatism. And I say that in part because I think one of the afflictions of our politics and our political discourse in this country is what I would call labelitis. We are much too quick to slap labels on ourselves and more problematically slap labels on each other. And I think neoconservatism, in quotation marks, is a specific case study in the need for a bit more sophistication, and I will also say intellectual openness to the issues that are involved. I have almost a knee-jerk problem with many words that end in the suffix ism, because it suggests a degree of uniformity, even dogmatism, and suggests an ideological quality in a pejorative sense of that word that is not justified by so much of the work that is done by people who either self-identify or are identified as neoconservatives. I don't think the phrase does justice to the complexity of the ideas, plural, and often the ideas that contend with each other that are bundled under the term. nor does it do justice to the diversity among the individuals who willingly or not have the lapel pin of neoconservatives. In fact, as Bill and I were chatting very briefly outside, the subject of climate change came up, and Bill said he's all for it. Why? Because he's for change. So we may or may not return to that particular topic in the course of the discussion this afternoon. There's another problem which bothers me actually more about the word neoconservative, and that is that it is, of course, a variation or a cognate of the word conservative itself. And my difficulty with that word is that it is so often used as a kind of antonym or antipode of the word liberal. And I think that that either-or typology, you're either a conservative or you're a liberal, is part of the problem in our overall debate. I think it's contributed to the toxic partisanship that has gotten so far out of control in this nation, and it's also contributed to the breakdown in civility of political discourse, as well as in the intellectual integrity of the political discourse. There's this implication that you're either one or the other. Yet I would say it's not just possible, but it's almost a no-brainer, if I can put it that way, to believe in conserving the best of the past and the best of the present, therefore being a conservative, while at the same time believing in the concept of liberty, which of course is at the root of the word and the concept of being liberal. And I think the headlines of the last week, particularly headlines with the dateline of London, have underscored the point that I'm making, where you have a conservative party teaming up with liberal Democrats to try to govern the UK out of its current difficulties. Last thing I would say in a personal vein, and then I'm going to say a word about Justin, is very personal indeed. When I came into the Department of State in 1993 and was charged with having to think about and help develop policies on a complicated part of the world, one of the first things that I did was to try to enlist as a colleague somebody named Eric Edelman. I think he may be known to some of you. And I did that for a number of reasons, including his expertise on military and diplomatic matters, but also because he was deeply steeped in the traditions and the school of thought that is often characterized as neoconservative. He would literally send me home on Friday nights with homework assignments that involved reading a lot more Strauss than I ever intended to read. I might add that there was a certain amount of Crystal and Fukuyama in my homework assignments in those days as well. Anyway, I hope I've made and not overmade the point. Much more interesting than my views are those of the panelists, and you know them well, but let me say a word or two about Justin. He is, in a way, kind of the quintessential Brookings scholar. He's been here, at least associated with Brookings, longer than I have, and he's a lot younger. He came here as a visiting fellow in 2001. In the great Brookings tradition, he has passed both ways through the revolving door, which is to say he's gone into public service, in his case in his native country, France, where he served on the policy planning staff, the most appropriate parts of the Quai d'Orsay to have worked, given his interests. And he has come back to Brookings, working as a specialist on Europe in general, of course, and in particular on the issue of Islam in Europe. He has an earlier book that was published by the Brookings Institution Press that I very much recommend on the subject of Islam in Europe, and that was done under the auspices of our Center on the United States and Europe. He has another specialty, which is the intellectual history of U.S. foreign policy, and that too has now borne fruit. Justin has been working on this project for a very long time. The time was well spent. The book is well worth waiting for, and it's a great credit to him, I think, that Bill and Frank would join us. They have been terrific over the years in many respects with regard to this institution. They have participated in our events. They have elevated and broadened the intellectual scope of our discussions in this auditorium and in seminar rooms elsewhere in the building. So I would welcome them back to Brookings and congratulate Justin on his first-rate piece of work and turn it over to EJ and to Justin first to get us started. So thanks. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Strobe, for your kind words, and thanks again to the panelists for doing this today. My wife told me not to summarize what's in the book, because if I did, you wouldn't buy it. So instead, I thought I would start by elaborating on Strobe's points. First, as Strobe related, the book is premised on a conviction. In domestic and foreign policy, ideas have consequences. It doesn't mean that material forces are secondary, but ideas, concepts, and representations that serve to interpret the world play an essential role in the policy process. This is especially true for American foreign policy, where elite representations matter more, arguably, than in domestic policy. Neoconservatism is a case in point. It is a quintessential elite movement, basically limited to a few dozen active people in Washington, D.C. and New York City. There are no prominent neoconservatives in Des Moines or in Memphis. There are no politicians who run on a neoconservative platform. And yet, the impact of neoconservatism has been sizable. This is not to say that a group of intellectuals can somehow control American diplomacy. The intervention in Iraq, for example, was decided for a variety of reasons, foremost of which was the transformation of threat perception by the American government after 9/11. But in that mix of reasons, a certain set of ideas and representations, including neoconservative ones, played a distinct role in making the intervention possible and desirable. Let me say here that the book is not a polemic. It's not neoconservative. It's not anti-neoconservative either, even if I point out what seem to me to be the shortcomings of the neoconservative vision in the most recent years. My goal in the book was to offer a political and intellectual history of neoconservatism, not a history of pure ideas, but the concrete story of men and women, think tanks, magazines, citizens' committees and foundations which supported them, of political networks who coalesced around certain ideas and promoted them in the political sphere, and their interaction with the larger American history. Which leads me to the second point that Strobe made about the label, about the neoconservative label. It's true that no two neoconservatives think the same about all issues, and many object to even being called neoconservatives in the first place. Labels are great simplifiers. But this would also be true, as you pointed out, Strobe, for conservatives or liberals or libertarians and other groups. What makes neoconservatism even more tricky is that its very substance, its definition, has been so profoundly transformed since it was born in the 1960s. Since then, neoconservatism has shifted from domestic issues to foreign policy, from the left to the right, and from New York intellectuals to Washington-based political operatives. To make sense of this complex history, I suggest in the book to look at neoconservatism not as one continuing school of thought, but rather as a succession of three very different families over time. The original neoconservatives, the Scoop Jackson Democrats, and then the latter-day neocons. Let me start with the first family. Neoconservatism was really a child of the 1960s. It is a result of the split in liberalism that occurred when some liberals reacted against what they saw as the leftward turn of other liberals. You have to remember that liberalism between the New Deal and the 1960s